So the pelvis itself is a very open, bony structure. The bottom of the pelvis, the cap, are the pelvic floor muscles. So when you're thinking about structurally, the pelvic floor holds kind of all our stuff, all our abdominal content in. So above here is our bladder, our uterus if we have one, and our rectum. And the pelvic floor muscles have kind of a few main functions. One, the superficial muscles, these kind of muscles that go around the vaginal opening in the urethra, are more of our sphincteric function muscles. So they kind of open close, okay? They're working with our bladder function, with our sexual health, and coordination of our bowel function. And then deeper are our deeper pelvic floor muscles, are more supportive muscles. These kind of help hold up our organs. And it kind of looks like a bowl. When you hear of the pelvic bowl, that's kind of what it looks like. So we've got your pubic bone, your tailbone, and your sit bones. And those are kind of the four main landmarks that the pelvic floor is attached to. And then we've got the organs I talked about, and then above it. So when you think about the pelvis and the pelvic floor, we've got our pelvis and we've got our rib cage above it. So the pelvis is supporting the rib cage on top. The pelvic floor is a parenthesis of the diaphragm. So when we inhale, our diaphragm compresses down. So when it compresses down to make room for kind of all that downward pressure, our pelvic floor lengthens and our belly expands to make room for that. When we exhale, the pelvic floor and the diaphragm raise back up. And it's kind of a piston relationship. So when we think about inhale, we think about drop, exhale, they rise back up, okay? So as long as they can move freely, then on the exhale, automatically our transverse abdominal muscles, our deeper core abdominal muscles, and our multifidi, our back stabilizers, will automatically engage and help stabilize us when we move. So when we talk about, we've got bladder and bowel and sexual health control and organ support, but we also have this stability. So when these muscles contract between these four bones, they are not moving anything. So they're not movers. That's what makes it kind of so confusing, that you don't see anything happen. But what they do is when they contract, they create stability. They're creating tension between these four bones. Same with the transverse, that deeper abdominal kind of corset. It doesn't move anything because it traverses and goes side to side. So when it contracts, it's creating stability this way, which is covering this big open space of the pelvis. So the pelvic floor and the transverse are creating stability in our pelvis when we move. So you can see if we have trouble with our transverse or our pelvic floor, we're going to have difficulty creating stability, and we're going to go to other compensatory techniques that aren't as optimal. So breath holding, tucking into different positions. So sometimes we'll tuck our pelvis to create stability where that core foundation is lacking. So when we talk about posture, so what is good posture? You know, we always hear about posture. I didn't really pay attention when I was young because I didn't really care if I looked like I was sitting up straight. But I would have cared if I knew that my posture could affect how I move, how I play sports, how I get around, or how I can protect myself from doing damage and causing pelvic organ prolapse or stress incontinence. So when we talk about posture, we talk about neutral pelvis and we talk about neutral ribs. So if we think of the pelvis and the rib cage as kind of like the teacups or bells, they both tilt. So our pelvis can tilt, can it tuck under, and it can arch. So it can move in both directions. And we want to think about a nice neutral pelvis. Nice neutral, so we're not spilling our soup forward or backwards. Okay, same thing with the rib cage. The rib cage can tilt, so bell rung up, or be kind of tucked under, which a lot of people, maybe if they're not so confident, tend to do this. Or if we have an illness and we're coughing a lot, we tend to be tucked a little bit more. So what happens when we get into these less optimal positions is we find ourselves disconnecting the pelvic floor from the diaphragm. So our system, if you think of this as a house, the roof of our house is the diaphragm, the floor is the pelvic floor, and then the walls are the transverse and the multifidi in the back. So all those stabilizing muscles, so the 4 units. So again, when I was saying, when we inhale, they drop. So they drop, our belly expands, we're not very stable. When we exhale, they come back up, so our pelvic floor is lifted, our diaphragm is lifted, our abdominal wall is in. That's when we're stable. So that's when you want to be thinking about using your exhale for exertion. So when you're doing a lift, or if you're reaching for something, you want to be exhaling. You don't want to be expanded and dropped. If the pelvic floor and the diaphragm are in line with each other and they have that piston motion when we're breathing and using the exhale at the right time, then automatically we're going to be stable and our transverse and multifidi are going to engage. We're born with that system. But with gravity or trauma or whatever compensatory technique, we start to move away from this alignment. So if our ribs are out of alignment, or our pelvis is out of alignment, or if they're like skewed forward or back or off to the side, so if we're holding our baby on the side and we've constantly got the weight, our upper body shifted away from our pelvis, then these can't communicate. So if these can't communicate, then the other muscles, stabilizing muscles, don't have a chance to do what they're supposed to do. So that's why the posture is important, is to be able to allow the pelvic floor and diaphragm to do what they're supposed to do. You can see if you're overarched, now it's talking, the pelvis is talking this way, not up to the diaphragm. And then, so breath holding is another big kind of focus for being able to manage the pelvic floor health. So if you think of this as a pressure cooker, you've got all kinds of pressures in here. Your release valve is your exhale. So if you cut off your release valve for your pressure cooker, the pressure is still there and is going to go to its weakest link. So whether it's going to go down to the pelvic floor and cause stress incontinence, or it's going to go down and disrupt the connective tissue to those pelvic organs and cause prolapse. It could go forward if we've got a diastasis where maybe our abdominal wall doesn't have as good integrity. We could be looking at different hernias, or just different further weaknesses of the abdominal wall. Or it could go to the back and we could get hernias or back pain. So making sure that not only are we sequencing the breath properly with our movements, but making sure that we're not holding our breath to create that stability. We're using our breath to create stability and using our muscles the right way.